Welcome everybody again to another episode of the ideaXme show, the show that profiles the humans behind the really big ideas that are shaping our world, shaping the future, inspiring future creators, all those are like really great stories. I'm Ira Pastor, your life science ambassador along for the journey today. We're going to start off with some rather fascinating numbers. The World Health Organization currently estimates that we have over 1.1 billion smokers on this planet still, and that tobacco kills around 8 million people each year. 7 million of those as a direct result of tobacco use, about a little over 1 million of those as a result of non-smokers being exposed to secondhand smoke. The United States Center for Disease Control estimate that smoking is responsible for more than 480,000 deaths in the United States, or about 1,300 deaths every day. And needless to say, smoking leads to both disease and disability and harms nearly every organ of the human body. More than 16 million Americans live with some disease caused by smoking, including cancer, heart disease, stroke, lung disease, diabetes, COPD, including emphysema and bronchitis, as well as it increases the risks of tuberculosis, certain eye diseases, autoimmune diseases, erectile dysfunction, the list goes on and on. Total economic cost in the United States alone, over $300 billion every year when one takes into account both direct medical care and lost productivity due to premature death and exposure to secondhand smoke. The Foundation for a Smoke-Free World is an independent nonprofit organization that funds research, promotes innovation, supports collaborative initiatives committed to reducing death and disease caused by smoking and ending smoking in this generation. They strive to identify and address the unique needs of the developing world as they relate to tobacco cessation and harm reduction, and serve as a convener of global research supporting reduction in tobacco use while helping to address the impact of decreased smoking rates on both agriculture and economies. The Foundation's work focuses on three core areas: health, science, and technology, agriculture and livelihoods, and ultimately industry transformation. I'm joined today by Dr. Yach, who is the founder, president, and board member of the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World, and has been a passionate advocate for health promotion and disease prevention, and has been a global health expert and anti-smoking advocate for the last 30 years. Dr. Yach is a former World Health Organization cabinet director and executive director for non-communicable diseases and mental health, where he was deeply involved in the development of the World Treaty on Tobacco Control, known as the Framework Convention for Tobacco Control. He's also the former chief health officer of the Vitality Group, executive director of the Vitality Institute. He was a senior vice president of global health and agriculture policy at PepsiCo, director of global health at the Rockefeller Foundation, and professor of global health at Yale University. Dr. Yach has authored or co-authored more than 250 peer-reviewed articles on global health, served on several advisory boards, including the World Economic Forum, Cornerstone Capital, and the Wellcome Trust. Dr. Yach is a dual citizen of both the U.S. and South Africa and has an honorary doctorate from Georgetown University, a bachelor's in medicine and surgery from the University of Cape Town, especially in epidemiology, the University of Stellenbosch, and a master's in public health from Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. He has numerous appointments, advisory boards, awards, and honors. He's also an accomplished long-distance swimmer. And one thing before we get started, the disclosure related to this show, the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World has received its initial funding to the tune of $80 million annually for the period of 12 years, beginning in 2018, by Philip Morris International. That being said, the Foundation has nonprofit status, and by law and policy, it has to operate completely independently from Philip Morris and cannot engage in activities designed to support its business interest. Thus, PMI can have no involvement or say in their work. With that introduction, Dr. Yach, thank you for taking the time to join us on the show today.
Thank you. Great to join you, Ira.
Yeah, real pleasure. We typically start the show by giving our guests the floor for a little bit just to talk about themselves. If you could introduce yourself, talk about your background, sort of where you grew up, how you got interested in medicine, in public health, and how you sort of arrived at the epicenter of this most important public health issue in 2020.
Thanks. Yes, as you mentioned, I'm from South Africa. I grew up there, still under the apartheid era, did medicine in South Africa at a time when we had a range of health-related issues. trained as an epidemiologist and a physician. We looked at what are the major killers of people in South Africa, and how do you have an impact? And at the time, issues like tuberculosis, the rise of chronic diseases, particularly cardiovascular disease, was becoming apparent. HIV/AIDS during my training was not an issue in South Africa at the time. Of course, it is now a huge issue. And underpinning it all was smoking. And when I looked at the data and the numbers several decades back, it became clear that if you wanted to make a big impact on public health, that was the risk factor where you'd have the greatest impact for your buck. And so we carried out a range of epidemiological studies. We looked at the economic analyses. I even at that time went off to the local tobacco company with some of my fellow students to get their view on what they were planning to do. And I remember this was in the early 80s, them showing us that the factory floors were very clean. They were doing very well for the environment. They treated their workers better than anybody else under apartheid. And I had to point out to them that's all true. The only problem was that their product was killing, and 50% of usual consumers would be killed. After South Africa, I went off to the World Health Organization as the first South African to rejoin at the end of apartheid, and had this unique opportunity to work on the tobacco treaty, which basically meant asking what is the best evidence that we have in the world on what works and what doesn't work to lower smoking rates. Most of it came from Norway, New Zealand, Singapore, Canada, the UK. And we realized that there were transnational aspects of what needed to be done. Advertising crosses national borders, smuggling and illicit trade cross national borders, and the research and insight to bring about change also cross national borders. And all of those transnational aspects lent themselves to a treaty akin to the way we think of environmental treaties to address climate change. And so over 5 years, the first and only treaty of WHO was developed and is now adopted and accepted by 181 countries worldwide. At the end of that process, and I'd had a very inspiring boss, Gro Harlem Brundtland, many regard as the mother of sustainable development, we realized that WHO would tend to go back to becoming bureaucratic. And that's when I came to these shores and became professor at Yale and did all these other jobs. But along the way, at the back of my mind, I was always felt the work had not been completed with the treaty. The treaty looked fantastic in paper, but moving from what is a document on paper to active on the streets, particularly of the developing countries and the large growing Asian cities of the world, really meant we had to take a relook. And in that process, I recognized that one of the things we had an opportunity to address was the fact that harm reduction was starting to take off in many parts of the world. And by harm reduction, we mean starting with that crucial insight that nicotine does not kill you. It's the other stuff. It's the combustion and the burning. It's the tar, which kills you, not the nicotine. So if you're able to separate the nicotine from the stuff that kills you, many people who seek nicotine for whatever purpose, a neuropsychological lift, some kind of stimulation that they feel benefit from, as many do with caffeine or other stimulants, you would actually bring the death rates down dramatically. The first product that had been out there for many years was snus, a Swedish product that gets put in the mouth. It's a type of chewing tobacco. And we neglected looking at that when I was at WHO because it was being developed by Swedish Match, a tobacco company. The period of the rise of e-cigarettes started over the last 7-8 years. And that also suggested that we would see dramatic declines in the bad stuff going into your lung. And yes, nicotine would continue to get in, but if you could bring the death rates down by 95% plus, that would be one of the biggest wins for public health. And then the third option, heated tobacco products, which don't burn, but heat, actually also deliver the nicotine. So with that in mind, we started a series of discussions that led to the creation of the foundation. And at its core, I'd always recognized that no country makes progress in any field of health or science, actually, if they don't have locally trained, good scientists able to adapt what they need for their local circumstances. And yet 90% of all the work done on tobacco was being done in the US and the UK and parts of Europe, leaving the vast majority of Asia, the Middle East, and Africa with virtually no science infrastructure to actually look at how you can accelerate change. The other thing over the years that I saw was that 20 years ago, when the first discussions around the treaty started, the opposition to it came from tobacco growing countries. They feared that as we progressed on reducing smoking rates in adults, there would be a decline in the demand for their leaf tobacco. And many of these countries are totally dependent. Malawi, 60% dependent. The reality was that for 15 years, this was not a particularly powerful argument because demand wasn't going down. It was actually going up. And you can't introduce alternatives at a time when there's still demand for a product. But what has happened in the last few years has been fairly dramatic. We are now seeing that absolute demand for leaf tobacco is going down. It's likely to continue to go down, and it may accelerate with reduced risk products, putting greater pressure on the countries who are most dependent on growing to think of alternatives. Otherwise, the economies will be in big trouble. And so when we put together the foundation, we felt it must address both the smoker and addressing the health consequences, which you so well outlined. But ethically and morally, you also have to address those who are going to suffer as the health winds start coming through. And that's the structure of our foundation.
I appreciate that introduction. And it leads into several of the questions I have. But before I want to do all that, I wanted just to spend a couple minutes, if you would, on the, well, I'll call it the 800-pound gorilla in the room. And that's sort of the Philip Morris name. And obviously, you know, on one hand, it's Philip Morris, and that might make some people feel, you know, upset or uncomfortable. At the same time, one can look at that and say, well, it's $1 billion that you guys get to do your work. It's $1 billion they don't have for advertising or doing whatever they would be doing. While I'm interested in it, I'm also equally interested, as a strange, of sort of the people or the organizations, you don't have to name any, of course, but are the types of organizations that were not interested in this, because, you know, I sit in my day job is in the pharmaceutical industry, and I'm always amazed when I hear, you know, these stories of you know, somebody worth $20 billion that dies of, say, pancreatic cancer, yet the foundation that's set up in their name to manage that $20 billion doesn't donate a penny to pancreatic cancer research. Were there any surprises along the way of, like, sort of some wins or, you know, organizations that you thought, hey, I'm going to deal with smoking and tobacco that might have been good funders? Instead, well, no, and hence Philip Morris came along. Or just walk us through that a little bit. I mean, it's very interesting to me.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Ira. You know, I mean, for 20 years, I've really tried to raise funding for tobacco control.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we started the work on the Framework Convention, the major funders were a few governments, and they were putting in, you know, $1 million here, 2 million, 3 million, nothing substantive. And to start the research work, we developed a research agenda while I was at WHO with the National Institutes of Health here, and went to them and said, you fund global health research, why don't you fund tobacco research in developing countries? And we created a unique partnership which lasted for 10 years and spent about $60 million on starting to support 11 or 12 centers around the world in developing countries. And I saw the incredible value of that, of what could happen. That was 60 million. If we got to scale, we'd be able to start making a dent. But unfortunately, the funding ran out and nothing new came up. Mike Bloomberg's foundation did actually step up, and over the last few years has funded quite a lot of funding of WHO directly. But the funding is fairly circumscribed to policy-related work aimed at legislative change, so warnings on packs, better educational programs, a range of issues that I believe are valuable, but will have long-term impacts. What they were not supporting was cessation for adults, research and development in developing countries to build their own capacity, nothing for the farming community. And also they seem to have taken their eye off the fact that we're seeing fairly strong moves towards women smoking at higher rates. And on that, people are always amazed when I tell them that 20 years ago, there was virtually no country in the world where the death rate in women for lung cancer exceeded that of breast cancer. Because we always think of breast cancer and they've done great advocacy. Today, we know there are 15 or 16 countries in the world where the lung cancer death rate in women exceed that of breast cancer mortality, in some cases by far, starting here in the US. And when you look at that, you say, well, what is the agenda? Who are the people actually involved in it? And we try to go to the researchers. In summary, I went to private pharmaceutical companies to see whether they would support work. And there has been work over the years. Pfizer did a lot beyond their work on Chantix, Glaxo. Many of them fund modest amounts, but nowhere given the size of a potential market of 1.3 billion smokers. And so when Philip Morris and I started having these discussions, we were fully aware that some people would come after us and say it's worse than working with the devil to work with Philip Morris. And colleagues basically said, I've completed my transition to the dark side by accepting the funding. And most of the critics come from very well-funded entities, either Bloomberg or the FDA, sitting in the US, where they have the largesse of being able to get tens of millions of dollars easily, but virtually none of that is available for developing countries. And there is no other major funder that we have found. I'm hoping through this process, and despite the harassment that many grantees landed up getting, or some of our staff are getting, we're making enormous progress, and we have now been able to disperse and approve over $150 million in grants worldwide. We have active programs in many countries developed. The agricultural work is moving quickly. But to say that it's been easy and that people have not been harassed would not tell you the full story. I feel that because it's so tough, it makes it even more important just to keep going. And we believe that all companies with an interest in health, and particularly lung health and tobacco, should be engaged. And we haven't started reaching out to the other tobacco companies, the e-cigarette companies, and frankly, the pharmaceutical industry, who have an enormous interest in the whole area of nicotine. They produce the patch, the gum, and all of these products. And in time, once we start showing even more dramatic results, I'm sure that they will come on board.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that background. You recently completed what was called the Global State of Smoking poll. It was in 2019. It was a sort of a second study that you did after a 2017 study. In this one, you looked at 7 different countries. You evaluated something like 55,000 adults. You talked about one of the learnings in your introduction about the tar versus nicotine. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the things you learned and what sort of the 55,000 adults right now, sort of what are some of the major insights that we have in 2020?
One thing we're learning through this COVID-19 experience is the value of epidemiology and sound data. Without strong epidemiology, you can't make rational decisions. And that's why even in the few months after we launched, the first thing we wanted to do was to understand the smoker. What drives them, their motivations, their perceptions of risk, their desire to quit, their problems, their struggles. And I mention that because when I was at WHO, I was as guilty as everybody else of shunning the smoker, keeping them away, seeing that they were more a problem. Yet, if we're going to succeed in reducing the smoking rates, we have to engage and show empathy and work with them. So the first set of studies were both detailed qualitative studies asking the meaning of smoking in people's lives. How did they associate it with coffee in the morning, or going to the bar at night, or with meals, friendship? And we found that across the world that the meaning was very different. There was no one simple formula. We also learned from those early studies what motivates people to really want to quit and what doesn't motivate them. When we came back on this last round, we focused particularly on this issue on how they perceive the riskiness of different tobacco products. So around the world, with the exception of India, our main focus was cigarettes, traditional cigarettes. Whereas in India, it was bidis, which are much cheaper, rolled up products, which have tobacco in them, and they're rolled in a tender leaf. 100 million users, and smokeless tobacco users. And the smokeless tobacco users in India have about the highest rate of oral cancer in the world. We wanted to know, how did they see the riskiness of these products? What did they understand about nicotine separate from the cigarette itself? And obviously, it's difficult in a consumer's minds to separate an ingredient from the delivery of device. But it's very important, because if they perceive nicotine as being deadly and dangerous, they would be less likely to try the patch, the gum, reduced risk products, which are predominantly nicotine, and stick with their cigarettes. What we found was that in most parts of the world, the level of misperception about nicotine was profoundly wrong, with very high proportions going up to the 70% in some countries believing nicotine causes cancer, where in reality there is virtually no evidence to suggest that. Even in countries like the US and developed countries, we saw high 40s, up to 50% of people believing nicotine causes cancer. In addition to that, we were able to compare how do they see alcohol as a risk versus wine or beer. And in most parts of the world, they were seen as a much lower risk. Alcohol itself seen as more dangerous than wine and beer itself, showing a difference in the way they saw cigarettes. A lot of the questions were about your intention to quit. And whereas in the UK, the US, the intention to quit is very high, in India and South Africa, it's relatively low.
Mm.
And if you don't have an intention to quit, you won't even think about trying. And we know the success rate of anybody on quitting is well under 10% a year. It's very difficult to quit completely. We then looked at, well, how do they see e-cigarettes? And this was very important. Remember, this was 2019. It wasn't actually, it was just as the epidemic of THC contaminated products hit the US. But it was, we were unable to, if we'd carried out the survey later, we would have seen the full impact of it. But we could already see some growing reticence to even think about e-cigarettes of having any positive effect given the negative media. Mm-hmm. So we believe, and as the articles get written up, I think the story will be one of how is risk being communicated to the public through the media, through the public health authorities? Where are they getting the information about whether a cigarette is more risky than an e-cigarette or a heated tobacco product or snus? Generally, our feeling out of the surveys, if you stand back, is to say that we have a lot of work to do to correct the misperceptions around nicotine. We have a lot of work to do, not about saying that cigarette causes lung cancer. Those people get that. But they don't really understand fully the risks that you outlined. Cardiovascular disease in most parts of the world is very important. Tuberculosis in India, in China, in South Africa is very important. And they don't see those links yet. Mm-hmm. So we think this is all very good fuel to help define the next set of research and interventions to actually help people make better informed choices.
So now let's go deeper into each of the foundation's focus. I'd like to start with the Agricultural Transformation Initiative. So I looked up some numbers. So tobacco currently 125 countries where it's grown, 4 million hectares of land, a third of that which is in China, yields about 7 million metric tons, and this crop annually is worth around $20 billion. You know, it's interesting. On a couple of previous shows, I had folks from the United States Drug Enforcement Agency talk about ideas for so-called crop substitution programs, and in those particular cases, it was, you know, how could we give something to either cocoa farmers or heroin poppy farmers to replace that, or to stop them from doing that crop entirely. And here it's, you know, a little different situation because we're talking about a crop that's just going to disappear. Is the goal to, I know you've begun, you mentioned earlier some of the programs like in Malawi, is the goal to give some of these farmers today something that's more valuable than tobacco, or is it more the view that, all right, this tobacco, as you were saying, is slowly going to disappear, hopefully, let's focus on that, or is it a combination of the two?
Yeah, I'd say it's a combination, and it depends on the countries. Mm-hmm. So if we take the big trends, and we've published recently, I think very important likely trends over the next few years, which basically show that China, India, and Brazil will be the dominant growers of tobacco. They are very high today. And all the other players are likely to dwindle in significance. Now, there are a lot of reasons why we're seeing a shifting demand. People are smoking less. Reduced risk products require substantially less tobacco. But we're also seeing a shift in the type of tobacco used. So India now grows most of the tobacco that's used for the nicotine required for the patch, the gum, and e-cigarettes. It's a much higher nicotine yielding tobacco. We require different types of purity and standards for the reduced risks and the harm reduction products as well. All of which come together in a negative way for the countries of Southern Africa, which have historically been incredibly important producers of tobacco, going back 100 years since the British started the growing there, literally 100 years ago. And so what we're seeing in Malawi, for example, is that 60% of their foreign exchange comes from tobacco. That's about the highest level of dependency on one source of almost any country in the world. Well, they are seeing declining demand at a time when we expect it to accelerate down, and at a time when they're seeing climate change having negative events. They had a cyclone in the north and the south of the country, literally in the last year. There's been major drought problems, floods, all of which means the economy of Malawi is very vulnerable to any shift in the demand for tobacco. So our approach, our philosophical approach with our partners and the Planning Commission of Malawi is to say that our goal is to help farmers move to alternative livelihoods and not specify a particular crop. It could very well be that, for example, the daughters of smallholder farmers, and a lot of them are women, their best long-term prospect is to go into science, technology, coding, whether it's in the rural areas or the cities, and not be on the land because the likelihood of income in any crop is not going to be so high. We're looking at a range of crop alternatives with our partners, and already we have people growing bamboo. We have people doing greenhouse vegetable production. We have folk looking at groundnuts. We even have some doing dairy in the farming areas. All of these, we'd say, are very, very early experimental. But we're hoping that through a consortium of a number of universities, both from the US, the Land Grant University of Michigan State, Minnesota Agriculture, South Africa's Stellenbosch, Malawi Science and Technology, and local entrepreneurs, we're physically building a Center for Agricultural Transformation. And in November, I was thrilled to be there when we planted the seeds, the initial bamboo shoots, and the building will be physically ready within the next 8-10 months. The government has provided a number of tracts of land for experimental farms for farmers to come down and experience what it takes to actually move from traditional tobacco. But none of this will work if what they produce is not linked to markets. So again, philosophically, I spent a lot of time when I was at PepsiCo understanding the nexus between having a purchaser of your crop and somebody who'll be able to give you a long-term purchase agreement, as opposed to a lot of good doing type of activity, teaching people to grow alternative crops when nobody's going to purchase them. In the case of Malawi, we've got to go where it's a mixture of what the market is going to demand and want and work with them, as well as look at this really thorny, complicated issue of the fact that Malawi's kids have some of the highest level of stunting in the world. Stunting means their height and their weight are below what it should be. 40% of kids are stunted under 5. And one of the goals of our program is not just to boost the long-term sustainable income of the farming community, but to make sure that that increased income benefits kids. That'll be the real test, because at 40%, they're about the highest in the world. So whatever benefit comes to the farmer needs to go to the family, and usually that means taking a very strong gender perspective. Now, that Malawi model is very different from, say, India, where the demand for tobacco for the foreseeable future will remain relatively high. So looking at alternative livelihoods requires a very different perspective. And there, the perspective is that the base incomes of people working in tobacco are very low. If you can find higher yielding crops, alternatives, jobs, you will be able to get them to move, but it'll be a much longer, much tougher option to look at.
Health science and technology. You obviously mentioned the pharmaceutical industry, where I watched from inside the nicotine patches in the 1980s, the sort of repurposing of certain neuropharmacologic agents. You mentioned Chantix. Is there much going? I mean, I'm sort of outside that now, but is there much going on that you see in terms of development of new pharmacotherapeutic interventions specifically for nicotine addiction? I remember reading some things about nicotine antibodies a few years ago. I don't know what happened to that, but is this still an area that that you see pharma or small biotech, let's say, investing in? Tell us a little bit about what you're experiencing on this particular front, if you would.
Yeah, great question. So first, we're very privileged to have both on our advisory body as well as driving some of the work. Somebody called Jed Rose, who in the 80s was the inventor of the nicotine patch. And so we asked him, that was the 1980s, Jed.
Right.
What do you have for the 2020s? Because people don't really like patches. They're all right for some, but they don't give them the same buzz or feel that, say, a cigarette does. Now, at least an e-cigarette's doing better. But surely the science has moved along. And one of the things we did was to look at, with a partner, what is in the pipeline of innovation for new cessation options, either by the pharmaceutical or the biotech industry. And the answer is very little. So even though you've got a market of, maybe half the people who currently smoke probably want to quit, maybe a bit more, maybe a bit less, but that's hundreds of millions of people. Why haven't they created products for those consumers? And I think the answer is kind of simple, and it's to do with the price of the product. Has to compete with the price of a cigarette. It means it's got to be very cheap. It's not in the mindset of the pharmaceutical industry compared to the blockbuster drugs. So what's the solution? And we believe the solution is work with pharma where we can. And in fact, our new head of health and science, Caroline Blankmeister, comes to us after years of work at Glaxo, Pfizer, Roche, to bring exactly that kind of knowledge, both in terms of drug development, but also the over-the-counter world. And we feel that in the same way as we, in this COVID-19 period of thinking about how do you develop something where there's no obvious large market purchaser, you have to address the market failure. And the way to do it, as we've done in vaccines in other areas, has been to bring the pharmaceutical industry together with biotech, but together with the big governments who are likely to pay, and the World Bank, so that you actually reduce the risk for any of them to innovate. And you do allow innovation, but you've also got to seed funding to actually say this is an area where we want to see greater levels of innovation. And that's where we think the foundation has a huge opportunity to really push and spur the innovation. And we're seeing already inventors come to us with new molecules, new ideas, but not just products like that, but linking them as well to the need for good advice. And of course, the cell phone, the smartphone, digital capabilities are profoundly important. Most of the success of the smoking cessation programs has been a merger of having a good product and high quality advice. Now, you can't go in many developing countries and expect people to have advice from doctors in clinics. It's simply not going to happen. So can you do it virtually? And the answer is probably. And we're testing in Bangladesh and with the telecommunications provider, the use of telecommunications as a means of providing advice. When we have a product to actually offer that's better than the patch or the gum or anything else, that would be the place to introduce it. And we hope we will see synergistic effects. We've set as an internal goal the desire to move our cessation products from achieving a success at 1 year of 10-12% of people quitting to 50%. And we believe the science will allow us to make those kind of breakthroughs. So on cessation, that is a very strong focus. And we recognize, though, in the short term and the medium term, we're sitting on harm reduction options, which can bring the risk down more dramatically. And where we see consumers are voting by moving off patches and gums onto e-cigarettes across Europe at a very high rate, because they're able to actually, they prefer it and they give what they want. And so our work is straddling the area of harm reduction and formal cessation. But, if you think of the patch or the gum,
Right.
the essence was that it also is a nicotine product
Right.
that didn't have the other bad stuff. So in many ways, those are actually the original harm reduction products.
Sure. Sure. Industry transformation. I've seen you've mentioned a few times the moving from the burnt products to the vaping and so forth, which obviously is one area that we all see the industry being transformed in. A few other things that come to mind, though. I remember I had in a previous career, I had an investor that was also an investor in an R.J. Reynolds spinoff that was developing nicotine type compounds for various neurodegenerative conditions and so forth. And then I saw a business plan years ago for certain, obviously a tobacco plant has many other things in it, thousands of phytochemicals of a corrosion inhibiting substance of all things that was present in tobacco leaf. Obviously aside from the vaping and all that, are there any interesting business plans, technologies that you see coming across your desk as far as repurposing of tobacco for other purposes entirely that we might not think of that may fit into this industry transformation concept?
Yeah, I think first, one of the big questions is, what are the current major tobacco companies going to look like 20 years from now? Will they be all out of combustibles? If not, why not? Can we not push them to do it? And I think that the spur of innovation in that field is happening very fast. So part of the industry transformation work actually involves talking to companies, understanding what's on their R&D agenda, what are they doing? And across the board, we're seeing, while Philip Morris was the first on the heat not burn product, many other companies have now jumped into it. BAT, Japan Tobacco, the Koreans, even the Chinese state monopoly. If you look at the Swedish match examples, snus I mentioned earlier, is a very important product. It's not all that much consumed in the US, but it's the first product that the FDA has formally approved as being a reduced risk product compared to cigarettes. And that was in October last year, the very first. And we think that if they go that way on the heated tobacco products and e-cigarettes, it'll open the door for even greater innovation. So many companies are betting that we are going to see a harm reduction shift where they will terminate their combustibles over time. Some have said so explicitly. And you asked about the innovation and technology. Well, it's a huge amount. When we look at the patent, so we're also looking at the patent filings. Who's filing patents for what? Well, to develop some of these products, you have to have new means of inhaling pharmaceutically active products like nicotine. Well, many of them are now joining up with pharmaceutical companies in joint filings, and we'll put out a report on it, not just for nicotine, but for pain medication and for other medications. So we suspect that their core knowledge that they've learned is not just about the tobacco world, but is closer to the pharmaceutical world than people suspect. So that is one area of innovation, I would say, within a traditional tobacco company where we're seeing a lot of work. We're also seeing others look at nicotine from a completely different perspective and looking at the intriguing work, which we know from years ago, that people who smoke a lot over the last 50 years, we have known have the lowest rates of Parkinson's disease. Those who do not smoke have the highest rates. What is the link between that, perhaps nicotine, and brain development? We know there are people looking at the fact that maybe there are going to be some memory retention benefits, maybe some Parkinson's benefit, which will open the door to a whole lot of other innovation. It's early days, but I think it's something to keep an eye on. But you also asked then about the plant, the actual tobacco plant. The tobacco plant is an extraordinary plant. It's got a genome twice the size of ours, I suppose, because it can't, get up and run if it gets attacked. So it's got all these attack defense systems. But because of that, we have seen innovations. The one we saw in Israel was the development of high quality collagen and proteins from the plant to be used for wound healing and to be used as a scaffold for 3D printing of artificial trachea. And we actually saw this in place, quite extraordinary. All the tobacco in Israel is actually going to this company, Coal Plant, to look at these innovative uses in the collagen area.
Sure.
We know that people have tested whether you could develop vaccines, the Ebola vaccine, inside the plant. And of course, now with COVID-19, there'll be, I think, a greater push to see how the tobacco plant could be a pharmaceutical development system in developing countries. And to answer your question, yes, there's tons. We've seen aviation fuel ideas, fiber, a wide range of alternatives. The problem is that a lot of it hasn't been pushed to scale. And I think that these, in the end, will be relatively niche, but they do open the door through the training of learning about how you do this to have people do better agricultural science outside of tobacco.
Sure.
So while you're in a tobacco-dependent country like Zimbabwe or Malawi, thinking about these alternatives, getting scientists trained in these methods, the ultimate win may not be in this, it may be in fruit and vegetable and other areas where much of the same agro-science knowledge is going to be needed.
Right, definitely. One other question while I have you, and with this one, and this is somewhat related. I ask you to take off your tobacco hat for a moment, but leave on your public health hat. According to the United Nations, currently there are 180 million people on the planet smoking marijuana today. It's shown that the ammonia that's found in marijuana is 20 times greater than tobacco. Substances like hydrogen cyanide, nitrous oxide, aromatic amines, 5 times higher. Polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, though they were lower in the main part of the smoke, the side stream smoke had more. This isn't a question about decriminalization or legalization or anything, but are we creating another problem in your perspective from everything that you study with tobacco, with marijuana? And I'd just love to hear your top thoughts on this issue.
No, and again, Ira, I think it's a critical question that isn't being asked with enough seriousness. I think within the US research community, NIDA and somebody by the name of Nora Volko has been raising these questions about the need to not just regulate one psychoactive substance, but to take the broad view and make sure that the society has the easiest access to the most inert products and the toughest access to those which are going to have the long-term damaging effect. Now, I would argue nicotine is about the closest to the more inert side. Marijuana, however, by the studies we've had from the National Academy of Sciences, shows a lot of negative impacts on the developing brain of the child, a lot of mental health related issues, a lot of impacts beyond that in terms of motor vehicle injuries. And we don't know what the lung effects are. They're not likely to be as great as tobacco, but they'll probably be marginal. But I think it's going to be the brain effects and the impacts of altered mental state on driving and other activities that will be incredibly important. And it is worrying at this time when you see many psychoactive substances now becoming readily available, designer drugs being used in schools. Obviously, marijuana, the growth of the THC market, the growth of the cannabinoid market, where there's a little bit of a breakthrough still, there may be impacts, and no public discourse. And I think that is something that we have to think of, but within the framework of saying, what is our social goal? It's not necessarily banning and recriminalizing, but it's really to make sure that the regulatory environment, particularly for kids, allows them to understand which of these products are relatively inert and will not have long-term effects, and which ones will. And at this stage, it seems as if the discussion of marijuana has almost become mute. It's almost politically incorrect to raise concerns about marijuana's effect on the brain at this point, because they focused on decriminalization and, I would say, accelerated profits around the country.
Thank you for that. Thank you. I noticed that in the background, I mentioned early on that you're an accomplished long distance swimmer. You've completed the Robben Island swim in South Africa. You've swum in the English Channel. You've raced around the Hudson River. Obviously, we're all quarantined nowadays. But any big long distance swims planned in the coming future for you?
Yeah, I try to do 4 or 5 open swims a year. I've been banned from all swimming pools, as we all have, for the next while. But we're watching the sea temperature in the Long Island Sound. Once it hits 50 degrees, my buddies and I will be there without wetsuits. We do not do wetsuits. We are serious purists.
You're very, very pure.
Yeah, and so we'll go back to doing those swims. And I did one across the Strait of Messina in Italy 2 years ago. I hope to do the Bosphorus in Turkey, ideally this summer if things get better. And I'm sure we'll all be back in the swim of it within a few months.
Hopefully, fingers crossed. Derek, it's been a real pleasure, having you today, and really thank you for taking your time out of your schedule and the situation we're in nowadays to talk with us for a little bit. For everybody that's going to be watching this episode on the internet or listening on the various podcast networks, I've been spending time talking to Dr. Derek Yach, founder, president, and board member of the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World. Derek, thank you for everything you're doing to get this scourge of smoking and eliminate it from this planet. And really, it's been eye-opening, and the information and ideas and concepts that you've put forth are fascinating, and I'm really wishing you the best moving forward with it. Thank you for taking the time, and as we say, moving the human story forward.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure. Keep safe, everybody.